Hello and welcome to Conscious TV. My name is Iain McNay, and today in the studio we really have got a fascinating guest. It's Matthew Manning. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, thank you.
And Matthew is probably one of Britain's best-known healers, but his story is an extraordinary story which starts off with quite dramatic things when he was 11 years old. So we're going to basically go through his story over so many years, and then we're going to really focus on the healing side in the end. So, Matthew, it really all started in terms of your story when some very unusual events started when you were 11 years old.
Unbelievable now, over 40 years ago. It was early 1967 and I had a younger brother and sister. My father was an architect. It was a straightforward middle-class family. My mother was a housewife. We lived in a modern house near Cambridge. But my father always had a very, very structured routine, and everything had to be done at exactly the same time. So he had his ritual of getting up in the morning at 6:30, coming downstairs before anybody else was up, opening up the all-night burning fire, then going back upstairs and getting himself ready. Then we'd have breakfast, then we'd go off to work or school. But one morning in February 1967, he came downstairs and noticed on the floor in the dining area a Georgian silver tankard, which was his. And he couldn't work out how it was on the floor. It was normally on a shelf further back, and had it just dropped off the shelf, it would have dropped onto the unit underneath. As it was on the floor. And of course, your first assumption, when you don't know anything about poltergeist activity or anything like that, is to assume that you've been burgled. It was quite clear that we hadn't been burgled. We had no pets, so it wasn't as if an animal could have got up there and dislodged anything. And it was one of those strange events that once in a while in your lifetime maybe happens, and then you sort of rather forget it. The next morning he came down, the same routine, and the tankard was in exactly the same place again. And this time he was much more suspicious. So, being an architect, he actually removed the shelf from the wall, wondering whether maybe somehow during the night the wood was warping and flicking the tankard off. Anyway, it wasn't. So this was the start of some very strange phenomena which were to last for several weeks in early 1967. And of course, when you have that kind of thing happen, it's not immediately diagnosable, and not many people would say, well, I've got a poltergeist in the house. My story in my life has been littered with strange, in quotes, coincidences. And one of the strangest of all was the fact that just after the war, when he was still a student, my father had bought a book by the great English psychical researcher Harry Price, and the book was called Poltergeist Over England. He'd read the book, and then he'd sold it again, so it wasn't a book that was in the house when we were children, but it was just something that he'd seen and thought was interesting. So when this tankard began moving, he immediately instinctively thought poltergeist.
Ah, so he had a reference point.
He got a reference point. And had it been any other father or anybody else, they probably wouldn't have had that point to start from. But even if you've got a poltergeist in the house, what do you do about it? Well, because initially it was just the tankard that was moving, but bit by bit over the next days, other objects began to move as well. I think on about the third day, a vase of flowers, which had been in another part of the room, was found at the place on the table normally occupied by my mother at breakfast. So my father thought, well, we need to get some advice or some help. And he went to various departments at Cambridge University of child psychology, experimental psychology, and so on. None of them were interested. All of them were sceptical. He wrote numerous letters to, at that time, people who were well known in the Society for Psychical Research. I don't think any of them even answered his letters. Then one night, I think in desperation more than anything else, because by now the activity of the phenomena was increasing, and there were very strange sounds, for example, coming out of the walls. And bear in mind, this was a detached modern house, but we were getting sounds almost like someone was sawing wood inside the wall. There were pinging sounds in the air, as if there was maybe an invisible bat going around. And my mother certainly was getting very distressed by it.
But how was it for you? Because you were 11 years old, these strange things were going on. Weren't you a little concerned or scared yourself?
I didn't really understand it, and I've often said to people, to be honest, children are much better able to accept strange things like that happening than adults are, because adults
Possibly true,
have
yeah.
developed natural lines of being logical and rational and analytical. Children don't have that. They have that childlike sense of wonder where anything can happen. So it didn't really frighten either myself or my brother or my sister. It was my parents who were most affected by it. So anyway, one night, my father went to the police station in Cambridge, and this must have been one of the strangest encounters ever in a police station.
Wow.
He went to report a poltergeist. I don't quite know what he thought the police were going to do, but there, and here was the second extraordinary coincidence, on the desk that night was a police sergeant, and his consuming interest in life when he was off duty was the paranormal and psychic phenomena.
Yeah.
So of all the police officers my father could have encountered, here was the guy that knew immediately what my father was talking about. And as police officers said, actually the man you need is somebody called Professor George Owen, who my father had never heard of. But he was a professor of genetics then at Trinity College in Cambridge, and was, and here was the third coincidence, the world's leading expert on poltergeist activity, and he lived less than 5 miles away. So he came to the house, and I always credit George Owen from that very early time with having given me a much more scientific slant or angle on how I see things and the way that I've worked over the years, because George Owen came in with great experience and he said, look, this is a natural phenomenon. In my opinion, it's not being caused by demonic intervention or by spirits or anything else. It's a bit like an outbreak of measles or mumps. It usually lasts for 3 weeks to 3 months, disappears and never comes back again.
But what actually is it? You're saying it's a natural phenomenon, but...
Well, George Owen said, invariably in his experience, there was a young person or an adolescent at the centre of it, usually in a situation of stress or friction or whatever. So therefore, on those grounds, because I, age-wise, fitted that window,
Yes.
I became the number one suspect.
Yes.
Because my brother and sister were younger than I was. And so anyway, George Owen then, he obviously also had to eliminate the fact that my father wasn't doing it. So unbeknownst to anybody in the family, not even my father, George Owen would turn up very early in the morning, sometimes at 5 o'clock in the morning, and actually wait outside the windows of the dining room or the sitting room, because the poltergeist phenomena only occurred in these 2 rooms which were joined together as one large room. And he would study and watch from the window to see if he could see anything happening. While he watched, and no one knew who was there, nothing happened. On several occasions, in the time it took him to creep from the window round to the front door, things had moved in the room, which was typical poltergeist activity.
But you see, is this like a dead spirit? Is it something that's connected itself to you? What actually is it?
Well, poltergeist literally are 2 German words meaning noisy and spirit. And it's a word which goes back over centuries, and it was always believed, which again shows how long this kind of activity's been in existence. It was always believed that it was a spirit, because I suppose in those days, it was seen in a more religious framework, and that was the way that people saw it or understood it. I think it's only now, with much more recent research over the last 40 or 50 years, by people like Professor Owen and Professor Bender in Germany, that people began to see that more times than not, it was actually associated with a youngster, because the phenomena would move wherever that youngster went.
So it's some spirit was connected with you.
I don't think it was even a spirit. I still don't think it was a spirit. I think it was some kind of energy which was within me and which caused things to move. And people often say, well, wow, that's amazing, because, as I'll tell you later on, more extraordinary things happen. But I've always likened it to the fact that there are some people who, for example, can't wear a wristwatch because it always packs up. There are some people who've only got to go near electrical equipment and it blows a fuse, or it just doesn't work.
So it's an energy, somehow it's an energy not quite aligned within that person.